A 20-year-old comes home from his mission 6 months early, and the first thing he notices is how quiet everything becomes around him. His parents greet him at the airport with a tenderness that is trying very hard not to look like grief. His ward does not ask why he is back. Within a few weeks, his photograph slips off the missionary wall at the chapel, removed by someone he will never identify, and no announcement is ever made. There is no talk in sacrament meeting, no welcome, no acknowledgement that he was gone and has returned, because the institution has no script for a missionary who comes home before the appointed time except the script of silence. And that silence is its own kind of message. It tells him, without a single word ever being spoken aloud, that what happened to him is not to be discussed, that his presence is faintly embarrassing, that the community would prefer to fold him quietly back into itself without ever naming the thing that brought him home. He learns to answer the unasked question before anyone asks it, to lower his voice when the subject of his mission comes up, to feel the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who all know and have all silently agreed not to know. He is not the first young man to live inside this silence, and over the next 2 years he will be very far from the last. For most of the last century, serving a mission was the single most defining event in a young Latter-day Saint's life, a rite of passage so central to the culture that declining it could fracture a family and trail a person for decades as a quiet mark of failure. That world is coming apart faster than the institution is willing to admit, and across the developed world, thousands of young Mormons are now doing the thing their grandparents could barely imagine. Some are openly saying no. Many more are doing the thing that frightens leadership far more than refusal ever could, which is to simply not show up, to drift out of the pipeline without confrontation before anyone can intervene. The internal numbers tell a story the pulpit does not, with applications falling sharply across several developed regions and early returns climbing year over year. And the church's recent wave of announcements, the lowered ages, the new training models, the aggressive expansion into Africa and the global south, are not the confident gestures of an institution overflowing with willing recruits. They are the calculated maneuvers of an organization watching its missionary base erode in real time and scrambling to rebuild around the loss, which raises the question this entire investigation is built around. Why is the generation with the most access to information about the church also the one least willing to go out and represent it? The answer is not a single thing. It comes down to 5 forces working at once. And by the end you will see how they connect into one conclusion the institution does not want spoken out loud. Part 1. The inversion of the board. For most of the 20th century, the church held a near-total monopoly on the information about itself. And that monopoly was the quiet foundation everything else rested on. The manuals, the lesson books, the ensign articles, the seminary curriculum, the carefully produced films, all of it flowed through a single institutional channel that was filtered, smoothed, and stripped of anything inconvenient. A young man preparing to serve read what the church wrote about its own origins, believed what it taught, and doubted only the things he was told were worth doubting, because there was almost nowhere else to look, and the few who did look were marginalized, disciplined, or quietly excommunicated until the lesson was unmistakable. That entire structure has collapsed, and it collapsed with stunning speed. A 15-year-old with a smartphone now holds more raw, primary, unfiltered information about the church's history than most stake presidents possessed in 1990, and crucially, much of that information was published by the church itself in the Gospel Topics essays, posted quietly on its own website around 2014 in careful language meant to acknowledge the difficult facts without dwelling on them. But the deepest damage here is not really about history. It is about what happens to an 18-year-old who was explicitly instructed not to read anything critical, and who is then sent to the front door of a stranger who has. Picture the actual scene, because the comments under your videos are full of people who lived it. A young elder, weeks out of a training center, stands on a porch having memorized a handful of lessons and a testimony he has been told never to question. The man who opens the door is calm, friendly, and curious, and within 2 minutes he mentions the multiple competing accounts of the first vision, or the seer stone in the hat, or Helen Mar Kimball's marriage at 14, and he is not hostile, he is simply better informed. The missionary has no answer, because he was never given one, because the entire training model was built on the assumption that the person at the door would know nothing. In 1985, that assumption held, and the missionary arrived carrying the information advantage to a public that knew almost nothing about Mormonism beyond the Osmonds and a vague memory of polygamy. In 2026, that advantage has not just faded, it has inverted, and the young man sent out to represent the church now routinely finds himself the least informed person in the conversation. What this produces is not theological defeat. It is something more personal and more corrosive, a kind of intellectual humiliation that the institution sent him into completely unarmed. He was told the doubts on the other side of the door came from Satan. He discovers instead that they come from documents, from sources, from the church's own published essays, and that he has been handed a script that shatters the moment it meets a person with a search history. Thousands of young Latter-day Saints are watching this happen to their friends and quietly refusing to be next. They are not lazy, and they are not faithless. They have simply concluded, with a clarity their parents were never permitted, that they will not stand on a stranger's porch defenseless to defend something they were never allowed to honestly examine. And here is what matters most for everything that follows, because the church is not blind to any of this. Leadership has understood the information problem for years, and the quiet institutional response has been to redesign the entire missionary system around it. By the end of this video, you will see exactly what that redesign looks like, and why former insiders describe it as the most deliberate strategic shift the church has made in half a century. Part 2. The Companion as Watchman. For generations, the mission was sold with a single irresistible phrase, that it would be the best 2 years of a young person's life, and that phrase did enormous work in convincing 18-year-olds to surrender their autonomy without complaint. But talk to enough returned missionaries with their guard down, and a very different architecture appears underneath the testimony. And the heart of it is not the long hours or the strict schedule, it is the companion. The companionship rule forbids a missionary from ever being alone, not for an afternoon, not for an hour, not even for the length of a walk, and the official justification is safety and accountability. What it produces in practice is something closer to a system of mutual surveillance in which the person assigned to be your closest friend is simultaneously the person assigned to watch you. Your companion sees when you sleep in, when your prayers feel hollow, when you linger too long on a thought you should not be having, and in principle, every one of those observations can travel up the chain to a mission president. You are never unobserved. There is no private moment in which to simply be a confused 19-year-old. No unwatched hour in which to feel what you actually feel, because the structure is built specifically to eliminate the unsupervised interior space where doubt and individuality live. This is the part that collides most violently with Generation Z. This is a generation that has built its entire identity around authenticity, around the conviction that the self is something to be discovered and expressed rather than suppressed and corrected, and the mission demands the precise opposite. It asks for the annulment of the self. It asks an 18-year-old to become interchangeable, to dress identically, to speak from a script, to subordinate every personal preference and emotional reaction to a system that treats individuality as a liability and obedience as the highest virtue. Music is restricted to an approved list. Films and news and ordinary entertainment are forbidden. Contact with family is rationed to prescribed days, and every minute is scheduled by someone else. For a young person raised to believe that hiding who you are is a form of self-betrayal, the experience does not register as spiritual refinement. It registers as the slow erasure of the person they spent 18 years becoming. And when that erasure produces what it predictably produces, anxiety, depression, panic, the system has historically had no language for it except failure. Early return missionaries describe coming home and being treated as spiritual casualties, met by bishops who avoid eye contact and ward members who lower their voices. And a young woman who returns at month 3 because the panic attacks have become unbearable is too often handed the same quiet congregational shame a community reserves for a moral transgression, as though her nervous system had committed a sin. None of this is hidden. Mental health professionals working with Latter-day Saint families have documented the pattern for over a decade, and the church's own publications have begun, very cautiously, to admit that missionary depression and early returns are real and widespread. But admission has not touched the architecture, because the architecture is the point. The mission still runs on the elimination of privacy and the subordination of the self. And for a generation that treats authenticity as non-negotiable, the calculation is not complicated. They are choosing to remain themselves, and the church cannot replace them fast enough to hide the gap. Part 3. The Window of Doubt. In October of 2012, the church lowered the missionary age to 18 for young men and 19 for young women, and it announced the change in the unmistakable language of Revelation. In practice, it functioned as something far more strategic, and understanding what it was actually defending against is the key to the entire story. The official framing was inspiration handed down from heaven, and the immediate effect was a measurable surge, with applications spiking, new missions opening, and a brief publicized window of headlines suggesting unstoppable momentum. That momentum did not survive contact with reality because the surge turned out to be largely an illusion of timing, the church having pulled a single cohort forward by a year rather than gaining a new generation, and because the younger missionaries struggled more, broke down more often, and returned home early at higher rates. And yet the lowered age has stayed firmly in place, and the 2026 announcements have doubled down rather than retreated, which only makes sense once you understand what the institution is really protecting. Lowering the age was never about saving the world. It was about saving the young person from the internet. There is a specific and dangerous interval in a young Latter-day Saint's life, and the institution understands it with precision. It is the gap between leaving home and committing to the church as an adult, the stretch of unsupervised time in which a person first encounters the historical record without a chaperone, first hears the hard questions from a roommate who is not afraid to ask them, first has a full semester of university where critical thinking is the entire assignment. Call it the window of doubt. That window is where deconversion begins, and a single semester inside it can be fatal to blind faith, because once a young person learns to evaluate evidence on its own terms, the carefully smoothed narrative of the manuals cannot survive the contact. Lowering the age slams that window shut. An 18-year-old shipped out immediately after high school never enrolls in that fatal first semester. He does not move in with friends from outside the faith. He does not start dating people who push back over dinner. He does not get the long, unstructured stretch in which serious research and serious doubt take root. He is removed, in the most literal sense, from precisely the environment where leaving usually begins, and he is held inside a controlled system for 2 years until he returns at 20 or 21, 2 years more invested. His entire adult identity now built around a sacrifice so large that walking away from the church would mean walking away from everything he gave to belong to it. This is not pastoral care. It is a strategy of preemption, closer in logic to a military operation than to a spiritual calling, and a growing number of critics inside the church, along with countless ex-members reading the 2026 changes line by line, are naming it plainly. They do not see revelation in these adjustments. They see regulation, the management of a retention problem dressed carefully in the vocabulary of divine inspiration. The age was lowered to reach the young person and commit him before the internet, the university, and the wider world could reach him first. Part 4. Billions against pennies. A 2-year mission is not free, and the silence around who actually pays for it has become one of the most corrosive issues in the entire system. The financial burden carried by a missionary's family runs into thousands of dollars across the length of the assignment. And for a working-class Latter-day Saint family, this is not a rounding error. It is a genuine sacrifice that reshapes a household for years. Picture the contrast directly, because the contrast is the whole point. A family in Brazil or in the Philippines stretches an already thin budget to the breaking point to keep a son in the field, cutting meat from the table, delaying repairs, postponing their own needs month after month, sending their contribution to the missionary fund with a faithfulness that costs them something real every single time. And the institution receiving that sacrifice sits on financial reserves that would embarrass a small nation. In late 2019, a whistleblower disclosure from David Nielsen, a former portfolio manager at the church's investment arm Ensign Peak Advisors, revealed that the reserve had grown to well over $100 billion, accumulated and held with extraordinary quiet. In February of 2023, the Securities and Exchange Commission penalized the church and Ensign Peak with a combined $5 million fine for using a network of shell companies to deliberately obscure the true size of those holdings from regulators. And here is the contrast that turns confusion into indignation. To that family in Brazil, $5 million is an incomprehensible fortune, the work of 100 lifetimes. To an institution holding more than $100 billion, a $5 million fine is loose change, an amount so trivial against the size of the reserve that it functions less like a penalty and more like a receipt, the cost of having been caught. The family sacrifices meat for the mission. The church pays its federal fine for concealment the way a person tosses coins into a jar. This is where the deepest breach occurs, and it is not really financial, it is moral. The relationship between a member and the church has always rested on an unspoken contract, that the sacrifice asked of the ordinary family is matched by the integrity of the institution receiving it. The concealment broke that contract. A 19-year-old today is asked to surrender 2 years of education and income, and several $1,000s of his family's savings to represent an institution that took deliberate legal steps to hide the scale of its wealth from the government. And that has never once shown him an audited, transparent, public accounting of where any of it goes. He is asked in the end simply to trust, and trust is precisely what the concealment destroyed. The arithmetic is not lost on these young people. They can see the commercial real estate, the agricultural empire, the global portfolio, the temple building program running at a pace without precedent. Dozens of new temples announced for places where the active membership is strikingly small. And they asked the question their grandparents were taught never to raise out loud. If the institution holds so much and guards it so carefully and hides it so deliberately, why does my family have to bleed to serve it? Part 5. Where the Internet has not yet arrived. The single most revealing detail in the Church's recent missionary strategy is not in what was announced, but in where the effort is being aimed, because the geography says what the press releases will not. Missionary expansion today is no longer pointed at Western Europe, where growth flatlined long ago, nor at the developed economies of East Asia, nor at urban North America, where the numbers have stalled and deconversion runs fastest. It is being poured, deliberately and overwhelmingly, into two regions, Sub-Saharan Africa and the parts of Latin America that lie outside the connected urban centers. And the honest way to describe this strategy is not as growth. It is as the avoidance of scrutiny. The defining feature these regions share is not poverty or faith or openness, it is information asymmetry. They are places where deep, organized, well-translated critical material about the Church's history remains hard to find, where the documentaries and the essays and the ex-member communities have not yet been rendered into the local language and surfaced to the ordinary investigator. In other words, they are places where the person who opens the door does not yet have the tools of defense that a young person in Arizona or São Paulo already carries in their pocket. The investigator in Phoenix can fact-check a missionary in real time, mid-sentence, on a phone. The investigator in a town where that material does not yet exist in the local language cannot, and so the conversation begins entirely on the missionary's terms, with the young elder restored to the information advantage that has evaporated everywhere the Internet has fully arrived. This is not a moral accusation so much as a strategic observation, because the Church is doing exactly what any large institution under demographic pressure would rationally do, shifting its operations toward the markets where its product still works as designed. But the implication is hard to look away from once it is named. The strategy depends on reaching people before they can defend themselves, on planting the message in the narrowing band of the world where the questions have not yet arrived. And a meaningful number of the young missionaries themselves are quietly aware of this. They feel the difference between the two assignments even when they cannot articulate it across the desk from a bishop. They name it in private messages to friends, in late-night posts to former member forums, in the honest doubt they would never voice in an interview. They understand that they are being asked to perform the institutional labor of expansion into ground, chosen precisely because it cannot push back. And a growing share of them are deciding, without announcement and without confrontation, that they would rather not. The story broadcast outward from Salt Lake City is one of growth, of revelation, and of momentum, narrated with the steady confidence of an institution that wants the world to believe nothing has changed. The story actually being lived by young Latter-day Saints is something entirely different, and the gap between the two is where this crisis lives. It is the story of an information environment the Church can no longer control, of a system that humiliates the young people it sends out unarmed, of a structure that demands the erasure of the self from a generation that will not surrender it, of a lowered age that exists to slam shut the window of doubt, of a financial concealment that broke the moral contract at the root of every sacrifice, and of a geographic pivot that some of the Church's own missionaries privately recognize as a retreat into the last places that cannot yet answer back. But here is the thing that the silence at the chapel, the missing photo on the wall, and the averted eyes of the ward all conspire to hide. The young man who came home early is not the failure in this story. The young woman who chose not to go is not the one who lost her faith. The missionary who stood defenseless on a stranger's porch and felt the ground give way beneath everything he had been taught is not the one who did something wrong. They are not the problem. They are the casualties of a system that refused to update itself. An institution that armed its young people with a script from 1985 and sent them into a world that had moved on without telling them, then blamed them for the wounds it inflicted. The responsibility for that does not belong to the 18-year-old. It belongs entirely to the leadership that saw the collapse coming, understood it with precision, and chose to manage it with concealment and strategy instead of honesty and transparency. The crisis the church is managing was never a crisis of faith among the young. It is a crisis of trust earned by the old, and the young people walking away are not the symptom of a sickness. They are the clearest and most honest message the institution has received in 50 years, sent by the very people it failed, and so far it is still refusing to read it.